Hey folks, welcome back. So I wanted to do a little bit of a review today for the Federation Commander Tactics Manual. I showed this off in my unboxing video that I posted recently where I got a bunch of FedCom stuff, a bunch of SFB stuff, all together in a big lump, and I showed off all of it. Since then, I've had the time to read through the entirety of the Tactics Manual. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what I found in here. And to cut a long story short, if you are interested in playing Federation Commander and you want to play it to a decent to high level, I think this is essential. It's a really great volume. As per usual, the PDF is too expensive. It should be less than the printed cost. That's just basic PDF math nowadays. But the Dead Tree product is a good value. It's about 124 pages, I believe. And it covers a whole bunch of different topics important to playing the game well. So the basics of tactics, maneuvering and battle, the basics of combat, independent of weapons, so thinking about firing arcs, shields, using directed targeting. Then it goes into specific weapons, specific ship systems, dealing with terrain on the map, and then Empire-specific tips, which are really, really good, by the way. Then some specialist tactics sessions for sections for different kinds of ships, including battleships, frigates, etc. And then there's some kind of advanced topics at the very end. And it doesn't mention it here, but there also is a compilation of command notes, and these are little what they call term papers in the SFB community. But these are little notes with tactical tips that players send in to the Captain's Log magazine that ADB publishes, and they've collected them all together, all the command notes that have appeared since the launch of the game. However, you need to be careful with these because some of them are from the early days of the game where the rules have since been updated or changed, and they may no longer apply. So it's useful to have those all in one place, but you may sort of cock an eyebrow at some of them when you realize that they don't actually work anymore. But nevertheless, it's good to see the evolution of combat tactics in FedCom from the early days. So when I picked this up, I was really pleased by the organization of it. I mean, it starts off, we'll get to the table of contents here. So it goes in a very sensible order from the basics of the game, and also clarifying the differences between SFB and Federation Commander, which is very valuable if you're coming from SFB. Basic glossary of terms that are used throughout the book, and then you get into things like the basics of having power available and the simultaneous decision rule, which often comes up in tactics. Then there's a whole huge extensive chapter on movement, then the basics of combat, then we get into specific weapons and specific systems, then terrain. I'm a little bit unsure why terrain is here. I might put that later in the book because it's a bit more of a, I don't know, it's not a very common topic, I find, unless you're playing certain scenarios or something. But the Empire tactics sections are particularly good, and as well as the special tactics, although some of them are quite short. But the Battleship one is of reasonable length and very useful, as is the convoy tactics. Then we get into advanced topics. Then they reprint all the most useful game charts at the end and the command notes. So it's a really sensible progression from basic to advanced for the most part. The book was put together, the lion's share of it was written and compiled by Patrick J. Doyle, who is, as I mentioned in the previous video, he's a multi-year world champion of Federation Commander tournament play. He loves the game inside and out and is amazing at it. And he took on the Herculean task of putting all this together. However, there are a number of sections that were contributed by, for example, Stephen Cole, the designer of the game, various other tournament players and specialists in different races, and he compiled those together. Everybody gets their due credit where they contribute, which is great. It's nicely laid out, and there's a reasonable number of illustrations throughout just to spice things up. So it's a really, really nice package. I do wish it was color interior, but this is ADB, so we don't want to ask for the world here. But yeah, I think it's a really nice thing to pick up. And it will appeal both to beginner players who are trying to wrap their head around the system and how it applies in actual play, as well as to intermediate players who want to take the next step, in particular if you want to specialize in certain empires with particular types of weapons. Now, there were a few sections that stood out to me in particular. One is the basics of maneuver stuff, talking about lag pursuit, lead pursuit, all this kind of basic maneuver. This was really, really useful for the beginner, I think. In particular, it links these concepts together with, what different types of Races, for example, would prefer the oblique attack to the, the different types of lead and lag pursuit. It gives you plenty of kind of illustrative examples throughout these sections to help you think about whether these techniques would apply to the types of ships that you fly, which is really good. The other section that I really enjoyed, the Romulan tactics. So there's a lot of good stuff on plasmas and cloaking devices in here. There's a couple of issues with plasma torpedoes in Federation Commander that don't exist in SFB, and this is something I wanted to talk about in a little bit of detail, because the designer has been kind of reticent to deal with it, although there is some progress being made on that front. So in SFB, the ships that use plasma torpedoes, they're quite successful and quite strong in tournament, very balanced against the other races, and the reason for that is twofold. So one, every plasma launcher on your ship will come with a pseudo-plasma torpedo that you can launch at any time. It doesn't cost any energy, and it performs exactly as a normal plasma torpedo of that type. But if it hits the opponent, nothing happens. It absorbs phaser fire the same way, it behaves the same way otherwise. That adds a bit of hidden information and a bit of a guessing game. The opponent doesn't know whether you're launching a real torp or a pseudo-torp, and that keeps them off balance and forces them to try and puzzle out what your intentions are. And it allows you to get more sort of counters on the board flying at them and keeping them occupied. Okay. The other aspect is that in SFB, it's much more difficult for your ship to randomly accelerate or decelerate, right? There are acceleration and deceleration limits in the game. And since plasma torpedoes run at speed 32, which is in most cases the maximum speed, 1 hex every impulse, generally ships have to do something to evade the torpedo beyond just running away. They might be able to run away for a while, but the torpedo will catch up, so we'll have to time things so that they only get the last fading vestiges of the torpedo rather than taking a bunch of damage. They might have to phaser it down, therefore using up some power and some weapons. So you have to face the torpedo and deal with it in some way, because you can't just sort of sneak your way around it. But in Federation Commander, you can do things like wait for the torpedo to come to you, burn several power to cancel a bunch of movement, and when the torpedo comes towards you, just side slip around and carry on your way and do these kind of clever tricks with acceleration and deceleration that just don't work in SFB. So the consequence is that for the plasma-using races, in particular the Romulans and the Gorn, they really suffer in tournament and balanced play. And actually, in this section, on the final paragraph here, so the author says, even following this advice, you may have an uphill battle against a fleet of equal point value. Experience has shown that players should consider giving the plasma-armed player, whether Romulan or Gorn, a 5 to 10% point value bonus, depending on the relative skill of the players, to help balance the game. I hope that this frank discussion will further illuminate the employment of plasma torpedoes. So that, to me, is kind of the big red flag that something should be done to even up the plasma playing field. Now, when this has been brought up on the FC forums, the designer has been quite irritated by this. I've seen comments to the effect that, the seeking weapon people want everything to be easy and blah, blah, blah. But I really don't think that's the case at all. I mean, these are very skilled players writing this volume, and they do thoroughly believe that the plasma races are disadvantaged. And the Romulans have another bit of a disadvantage, in a sense, in that the cloaking device in FedCom is also a lot weaker, rules as written, than in SFB. Because in SFB, when you cloak, you automatically, any seeking weapons that are following you, they will lose tracking. So you disappear into your cloak, any missiles, torpedoes that are following you will drop off the board as well. That's not the case in Federation Commander. And also in Federation Commander, if your cloak is interfered with, or called voided for a period of time, you lose all the protections of that cloak, basically. Whereas in SFB, you retain the damage reduction and some other aspects that still protect you a little bit, even when your cloak is not fully active. So, having said all that, there was a discussion on the forum in 2020 about the cloaking rules, which seemed to indicate that the designer was willing to accept a change to the cloaking rules. And in fact, once I saw that, and the rules written down by Mike West and seemingly approved by Steve Cole, the designer, but I've not seen them being placed into the updated rulebook. The rulebook hasn't been updated since 2014, in fact. But the added sections to the rules basically clear up this whole problem. So you can see them, I've written down on my little reference sheet here. So the updated cloak has 2 new rules in it. One is that when the ship becomes fully cloaked, seeking weapons can lose tracking. And then I'm not going to go into the detail, but basically, if you're moving at speed 0, all seeking weapons 1 hex or more away from you are taken off the board. And then as your speed goes higher, that distance is increased. So at speed 8, seeking weapons more than 4 hexes away are removed, etc. Then the second rule is about the voided cloaks that I mentioned. So if you have a voided cloak, it still reduces damage from weapons by 50%. So those 2 changes alone would substantially help the Romulans, because the problem for the Romulans in an equal point game is that they're paying for a cloak that it also says in this guide straight up. Basically, you'll never use the cloak after the first turn because it's just not very effective. And if your opponent is playing properly, they'll be launching things at you that cannot be evaded by the cloak. And so it's completely pointless. It just costs you energy and doesn't do anything for you. But if the cloak were updated in line with those rules proposed on the forum and seemingly approved by the designer, then that problem goes away, and I think it would substantially improve play for the plasma races. As far as the torpedoes themselves being easier to evade, and ships in Federation Commander also have a generally higher amount of power, as well as having no acceleration limits, so they can typically run away much more effectively than the equivalent ship in SFB because they don't pay things like housekeeping costs. One great idea that I saw on the forums, which again was proposed by people like Mike West and Patrick and other strong players, was to simply add back in the enveloping plasma torpedo. So this is a feature of SFB. I've made a little table here in the FC style. Basically, all that it means is that you, when you arm your plasma torpedo, and it only works for the bigger ones, ignore the M, that's for X ships, which are not officially in FC yet. So the R, S, and G torpedoes, you can make them enveloping. And what you do is, on the final turn arming cost, you pay that once more again. So if it's a Type R torpedo where you pay 2 on your first turn, 2 on your second turn, 5 energy on your last turn, you pay 5 more energy, then you can launch it as an enveloping torpedo. And what that does is it doubles the size of the warhead. So the R is normally a 50-point warhead, and here as an enveloper, it's 100. And then basically every step on the table as it goes along, the warhead size is doubled compared to what it is normally. And then if it hits the opponent, instead of hitting all at the point of impact, you divide the total warhead size by 6, and you apply that much damage to every shield of the opponent. Okay, and this is a really great solution, because what this does is it means that that size of a plasma torpedo is not something you can easily ignore. You can't phaser it down very effectively because the size of it is so large. And basically it does more of what a plasma torpedo is supposed to do, which is force the opponent to react, to use weapons, to speed away, and gives the initiative to the plasma player. And the fact that you have this ability as well to crunch down on every single shield, that's powerful. It's not as powerful as, if you could punch 100 points straight through a shield and wreck the whole ship. That would be unbalanced, of course. But being able to crunch down on all the shields at once is a significant deterrent to getting hit by one of these. And basically, it just gives you a couple of more impulses where the torpedo is a real threat. So I think that's a fantastic idea. It's really easy to understand. Writing up a rule for it is very simple. There's also another plasma option in SFB called the plasma shotgun. Now I've made a more complex table here, which I'll explain in a minute. Now the plasma shotgun is a similar idea. It costs the same as making a torpedo enveloper. You just pay the final turn arming cost the second time. And then what happens is your R, S, or G torpedo instead splits into a number of F torpedoes. Okay, so if you charge up your plasma R as a shotgun with the extra energy, it becomes 5 F torpedoes. And they each need to have a separate target. So what that does is it allows you to take your big old torpedo that you've charged up and fire it against multiple small targets. Could be, fighters or shuttles or small frigates that suddenly end up on your tail or whatever. And it gives you another bit of flexibility with your plasma that, again, is very easy to understand. You just pay the energy, instead of putting out 1 counter, you put out 5 counters for your R. Instead of one S torpedo counter, you put out 3 Fs. Very simple. Now, the sort of interesting playtesty kind of journal called the Stellar Shadows Journal that's published for SFB included some additional options for multi-shot plasma, and those are called the scattergun and the buck and ball, and these just extend that concept. They cost exactly the same again. You pay the final turn arming cost a second time, then you launch, but instead of launching multiple F torpedoes, you launch double the number of D torpedoes. Now, the D torpedoes, of course, are only strength 10, and they only last for half a turn, 4 impulses, but they're a great deterrent, again, against small problems like fighters, shuttles, etc. Then you have the buck and ball, which combines the two. So instead of having 1 R torpedo on the board, you would put out 2 F torpedoes and 6 D torpedoes, allowing you to mix and match between super small and other sized targets that need a bit more oomph, more punch to the torpedo. So I personally think that part of the imbalance that's been shown in high-level play with plasmas, probably most of it could be solved just with the enveloping torpedo, which allows another significant threat from plasma launches that would force opponents to react. But also, I think there's nothing wrong with allowing, now that fighters are going to come into the game, also allowing the plasma shotgun, at least. Now, in the Stellar Shadows Journal, the scattergun and buck and ball also add 2% each to the BPV cost of the ship if you buy those. And I think that's quite reasonable. So if you wanted to play test these rules in Federation Commander, I would say give the envelopers and the shotgun for free to the plasma ships, but the scattergun and buck and ball charge an extra 2% BPV cost. The other one that I've converted over from the Stellar Shadows Journal is much more wild. It's called the Starburst Plasma Torpedo. This one is really on the edge, but I do want to play test it at some point because it is a lot of fun. This is similar to the shotgun, except this is a delayed shotgun. So what you do, again, very simple to understand, pay the final turn arming cost 1 additional time. Then when you launch, it starts out as a normal torpedo, and then as it goes along, at any point, that torpedo can burst according to the decision you made at the moment of launch when you want it to burst. You look at the table, and here, for example, if it was 3 impulses after launch, and you say it's going to burst now, your R torpedo would burst into 4 F torpedoes, which could all take on new targets. Okay, so again, that allows for an unexpected surprise. You can launch that into the middle of a formation. Suddenly, there's a bunch of F torpedoes shooting towards different ships, and you can cause your opponents to have to peel off, deal with this new threat, and it forces them to maneuver, which is the point of seeking weapons in these games, is that they force opponents to react with maneuver, and they're the only type of weapon that can really force that to happen. Now, this is a very unusual ability, and so in Stellar Shadows, they recommend an additional 10% BPV cost to ships that adopt this ability. So it's something I'm going to play test as well. But I quite like the idea of, in the guide here, it says that if you're playing a plasma race, then you should get a 5 to 10% BPV bonus. Why not use that to buy some extra plasma abilities for yourself? Mix it up a little bit. Buy yourself a scattergun and buck and ball, or buy yourself a Starburst plasma torpedo, and see how you go with it. Maybe that helps even the tables. Ignore the other stuff down here for now, but this is my kind of playtest sheet of plasma adaptations from SFB. I think at least the shotgun and the enveloper deserve to be reintroduced to the game, in my opinion, to help even the score that's illuminated here. In particular, the fact that both the Romulan and the Gorn struggle is interesting as well, because the Romulans, you would think, might struggle a bit more than the Gorn because of the cloaking device cost, which, in the rules as written currently, is not really worth it, right? So they automatically have a bit less useful BPV. However, the Gorn also suffer because the only really useful plasma in FedCom for forcing maneuver is the plasma R, because it's so big that people have to deal with it. But not as many Gorn ships have the plasma R. They mostly have plasma S, plasma G, and they'll have multiples of them, but it's not the same type of threat as a single or double plasma R. So that actually gives them additional weakness as well. Plus, they are not as maneuverable as the Romulans. And in FedCom, the old tactic from SFB of the Gorn anchor, where you tractor an opponent and jam them full of plasma, is a lot harder to pull off in FedCom because you can only tractor from range 1. In SFB, you can tractor from range 3. Okay. So in the end, I think they both suffer similar amounts because they have different weaknesses that add up to a similar level. But it was really interesting and in a way validating to see these problems illuminated amongst these two plasma chuckers by these very experienced players. I know that the designer would probably disagree with me about bringing back envelopers and shotguns, but I think it's a really nice way to go, try and even the score. I think he does agree that the cloak needs to be updated, so hopefully we'll see that in the next edition of the reference rulebook. So after that major digression, I would say that all the rest of the Empire-specific tactics are really good. I think the Kzinti is a little bit short. I was expecting a bit more, but I guess they're really not that complex, compared to some of the other races. They're big on drones, so it gives you advice on how to use your drones, how to deal with your particular enemies like the Lyrans who have ESGs to deal with drones. So there's enough there to get you going, but I think there could be a little bit more depth in that section. However, the Tholian tactics right here, I really, really enjoyed this. I'm a Tholian fan. They give great advice right at the beginning about things like what ships to use in your fleet. They encourage using a lot of the Tholian patrol corvettes, which are really cheap, but they're also really fast and very effective when you use proper web tactics. So that's really good advice. They also talk about the value of the webcaster, how to use your webs to defend bases. And then the Neo-Tholian tactics that follow is all about webcaster stuff, and this is really great. I've used the webcaster before. It's quite a challenge because the web does not solidify right away when you cast it out. So you really have to be thinking ahead of what your opponent's going to do. And you need to think about placement. You need to think about how much energy you're going to put into it. Tons of advice, good advice on all of that is in here. So if you're looking to play the Tholians and Neo-Tholians, which I highly recommend, these two sections I think were particularly strong. They pack a lot of useful information into a small space, but it's all very readable and all really helpful. And for somebody like me who'd consider himself an intermediate player with some experience, I did learn some great tips from here. The Celtorians here as well, there's some good tips on them. One thing that people, I think, forget about the Celtorians is that they have a lot of Marines and transporters, so you really want to use their shield crackers, knock down some shields, and do lots of Marine raids. They're very, very good at that, much like the Klingons. The Lyran section is also really extensive. Lots of coverage here for the Lyrans. Good, 5 or 6 pages on them. So really good for Lyran players. The Hydrant tactics as well are high quality. They give you tips on Hellbore usage, Fusion usage, using your fighters, how to respond to the Lyrans and their ESGs and the Klingons. Really, really good stuff for them. Yeah, honestly, all of the Empire-specific sections are really useful. And I was particularly interested to see that there's quite a bit of depth on the Vudar, who I've mentioned in a previous video I don't know much about. By the way, there are some typos in this book, as you can see here, IPG functions. But not so many that it spoils the experience, but it is unfortunate. But yeah, there's 2 and a bit pages here on the Vudar, which is great. I'm definitely going to study this in a bit more detail and then go and try them out in-game. I certainly have all of their cards now from the boosters, so I will be able to have that opportunity. The Andromedan section, likewise, is very good. The Andromedans do take a bit of investigation to really kind of understand how their special systems work, but they're really rewarding to play when you do so. The ISC one is interesting because they talk about the historical echelon fighting tactics of the ISC, where they fly in this kind of formation. My understanding, I don't play ISC that well, but my understanding is that actually flying an echelon formation in-game is not really all that effective. If you want to play in a sort of historically relevant way to the SFU, then go for it. But my understanding is that you actually wouldn't do it in practice all that much. But nonetheless, it's good to have those tips in here because maneuvering in formation is difficult. So even if you're not going to do an echelon, you will have fleets of any race at some point who need to maneuver as a unit and cover each other's backs. So it's useful to have some tips on that. The ISC ships in general are really well balanced. So that actually might be a good place to start. If you're kind of don't want to get into ships with very clear weaknesses you don't know how to deal with, the ISC are pretty strong and well balanced. One thing to note as well is that throughout the book they have these SFB notes with grayback type, and they basically explain key differences from SFB that would be useful if you are an SFB player or just, you know, are a little bit curious how the two game systems differ in some respects. Now the special tactics, which I mentioned, the battleship tactics I found really useful. I love flying battleships in FedCom and in SFB, so having a dedicated section for how to use them effectively was really cool. And also there's some tips on how to deal with them as well. The frigate tactics are quite short, just half a page, but there's not too much to say about them except that frigates in FedCom have a movement cost of 1/4 point, which is very, very small, so they tend to be extremely fast. And they have lots of power, so they can be surprisingly effective. So they actually recommend that you don't use too many 1/4 movement point frigates in a game because it can unbalance things, which is, again, good advice. And then there's tactics on attacking and defending convoys, which is a common scenario, so that's pretty good. Tactics on defending bases, attacking bases, dealing with ground bases on planets. There's a section on the middle year ships, although I believe this is copied over mostly from briefing number 2 itself, which is where all the middle year ships are. And then you have the advanced topics here at the end. So yeah, as you can see, I mean, it's a great book. It really got me thinking about a lot of different topics. In particular, some of the imbalances that I've seen with the plasma races got me to work on these new tables here and to think about playtesting some of this stuff. And I really enjoyed the sections on the Hydrons, the Tholians, the Lyrans. All the major races get great coverage. So it's definitely, if you want to play FedCom, no matter what empire you specialize in, what kind of ships you like to fly, there will be something in here for you. So for that, I highly recommend it. I think it's, you know, the book is just a simple, you know, perfect bound paperback. Again, you know, no color interior or anything like that. But it is a really nice piece of work. It feels nice and solid. I don't think it's going to come apart anytime soon. And certainly I will keep referring to this for some time to come, especially as I experiment with empires that I've given short shrift, like the Vudar, or when I get into specialist scenarios and have to deal with stuff like pulsars, black holes. Really, it's very comprehensive and an excellent piece of work by Patrick J. Doyle. So congratulations to him. Again, I would say, you know, think twice before you buy the PDF version alongside the paper version. I think $50 is a bit too much to ask for this in both forms. I would choose one or the other. But hopefully, you know, again, I've complained about this before, but if the PDF prices come down a little bit, then I wouldn't hesitate to buy an electronic copy as well. But I just can't justify $50 on this, despite the high quality, because $50 will normally buy me a beautiful full color hardback from any other publisher, so it just doesn't feel worth it in terms of the physical product. But there you go. That's a tactics manual for Federation Commander from Amarillo Design Bureau. Hope you found that review useful. If you have any more questions about the content or anything like that, feel free to ask me in the comments. Or if you want to hear more about the playtest rules for Plasma or the new cloaking rules, I'll put a link to a discussion about the cloak and the enveloping plasma torpedoes in the description. The other stuff is just my own experimentation, but I'm happy to share that with others if you want to try it for yourselves. In the meantime, if you pick up the tactics manual for yourself, let me know what you think of it. I hope you enjoy it. Leave your comments down below and stay safe, healthy, and I hope to see you in the next video as well. All right, take care. Bye-bye.